Good afternoon and welcome to MICIP Mondays. I am Nakia Irby, one of the Educational Improvement Consultants, and I have the pleasure of kicking off the first of 5 sessions in our MICIP Mondays Technical Assistance Series being offered by Wayne Risa. MICIP stands for Michigan Integrated Continuous Improvement Process. Today's session will focus on developing a mindset where equity matters. At the end of today's session, you will have an opportunity to share questions or comments about how we keep equity at the forefront when planning for MICIP. Let's take a look at our agenda for today. This afternoon, we will dive into defining MICIP through an equity lens. We will review the whole school, whole child, whole community model, along with systems, and apply an equity focus. Finally, we will discuss the building blocks of forming a team with equity in mind. Feel free to use the chat function to drop in your questions, or you can hold them until the end of this video, and we will address them to the best of our ability at the end. This session also has the opportunity to earn sketches for those that remain for the duration. We will be using the Zoom report as well as the sketch evaluation at the end to confirm your attendance. It's my pleasure to present alongside my colleagues on the Educational Improvement team here at Wayne Risa. Colleagues, please go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Good afternoon and welcome. I am Vanetta Clark-Tools, Education Improvement Consultant for Wayne Risa. It's my pleasure to be here with my colleagues today. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Natalie Turner, and I'm an Educational Improvement Consultant here at Wayne Risa, and I welcome you to our first session of MICIP Mondays.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ashara Shepard-Lance. I too am an Ed Improvement Consultant, and thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you, colleagues. We're going to begin today's presentation by defining MICIP through an equity lens. MICIP requires a shift in mindset around continuous improvement and provides the opportunity to examine many ways to support students, both academically and emotionally. The inclusion of equity in these continuous improvement practices ensures that the needs of all students are being considered. As we examine the components that make up MICIP, we have to ask ourselves several questions. First, how do we build equity through MICIP? Do all students and adults receive the opportunities, environments, and supports based on need rather than on equal distribution? Are we engaging in the work that we've always done because of comfort, or is it based on data? And what type of data are we collecting and analyzing? The components of MICIP are continuous improvement, whole school, whole child, and whole community, and systems thinking. Threaded throughout all of it is equity. How do we ensure that we keep equity at the forefront of our thinking and not as an afterthought? Simply by making sure it's woven through everything we do in the continuous improvement process. During the continuing improvement process, we have an excellent opportunity to build equity. When designing our goals, are we truly committed to the success of all, or are we just a collection of individuals and schools, each with its own interests? Have we adopted the mindset that we are moving from one annual cycle for compliance and shifting to ongoing cycles of improvement planned and implemented by a district-wide community of improvement? We will make these questions available for you and your district or school teams to jumpstart your thinking and allow you to be inwardly reflective as you plan. So how do we keep equity at the forefront of our planning? Let's watch this quick video, which defines equity in education in its simplest terms.
So a friend of mine had talked about just equity in general being the existence of difference. But another friend of mine said that when we're providing equity, we're giving kids the ability to live life on their own terms, which is to say, we provided the educational opportunities where they can decide what they want to do, rather than having their decisions foreclosed for lack of knowledge. And so when I think of equity, I think of fit. What fits the people that are in my room, and what can give them the ability to live life on their own terms when they leave me. So I don't want to be the system and the dispenser of knowledge myself. How can I create the conditions for inquiry to occur, to develop the skills they're going to need to be independent from me, so that they can then practice that stuff on their own? I'd rather not be like a superstar to them. I'd rather be a Sherpa. You know, I'd rather be the guy that's guiding them through, and then they start to understand, you know what, I can do this. Because you can only know what you can do when you do it independently.
Yeah.
And so how are we setting up our systems, you know, for all of our vulnerable children so they can live life on their own terms? I think that's equity in the best way that I understand it now.
I love that video and that explanation because it lets us know that we must equip everyone with what they need in order to be successful. Josh Parker, the former Teacher of the Year, was saying that educational equity means that each child receives what they need to develop to their full academic and social potential. So to sum up this section, equity in practice means that we are addressing the needs of all students, the academic needs, social, emotional, and health needs. We're compensating for the disadvantages that we know exist in many of our communities. We're recognizing that children learn in different ways and at different paces, so we don't have a cookie cutter approach as to how we do instruction. We're staying focused on the outcomes, academic and developmental. And we're creating a culture of continuous improvement where we are mindful of the goals and we frequently revisit, monitor, adjust, and evaluate through implementation. Vanetta will further our conversation as we continue to examine how equity is woven through each component of MICIP.
Thank you very much, Nakia. Equity in practice is a big deal. And so as we shift, we're going to look a little bit more closely at the WISC model, systems, and an equity focus. The WISC model is Michigan's whole school, whole child, whole community framework. It challenges educators at the district level to look at the needs of students based on data, to think critically and equitably about ways to remove the barriers and obstacles that show up for students as needs. And then those same school leaders use the funding intentionally to provide students with the supports, scaffolds, supplies, and encouragement needed to be successful. Equitable school communities participate in chess. Strategies to educate the whole child require a shift in thinking that all students deserve a high-quality education that meets their personal needs and prepares them for life beyond the classroom. A strategic approach is more like chess and less like checkers. As leaders, we must be thinking and moving several steps ahead with an equity lens for planning, preparation, problem solving, and resource allocation that provides what every child needs. Equitable education requires proactive, asset-based, solutions-oriented approaches to teaching, learning, climate, and culture. When keeping equity at the forefront of your thinking, ask yourself these questions. How do we build equity through MICIP? Do all students and adults receive the opportunities, environments, and supports based on need rather than on equal distribution? Are we engaging in the work that we've always done because it's comfortable for us, or because it's a skewed look at the data? And to that end, what type of data is being collected and analyzed? So always remember that serving the whole child in the WISC model is very much chess and not checkers, providing a challenging learning environment for all students, ensuring that students are healthy, engaging students and families, safe learning environments are provided, and supported learning is available to everyone. The whole child approach focuses on child development. It is holistic. It looks at social, emotional, and academic factors with the idea that differentiation is available to every child based on their personal needs. Neuroscience tells us that the brain requires the use of strategies to promote cognitive development and to mitigate harmful factors. So we then must understand and respond to the ways that students are affected in the school, in the classroom, by their family, with their peers, inside the community, and society at large. When using an equity lens to examine the WISC model, your team will come together to examine your data with equity and understanding the root causes behind the numbers that present themselves for your students. How are bilingual students being impacted by your school or district's current practices? When you're examining curriculum as a team, are you considering bias? Is the curriculum culturally responsive? In what ways might systemic racism, representation, bias, unconscious bias even, be impacting student performance in your district? When examining non-academics like student health, family crisis, food insecurity, divorce, even the pandemic, how are these things impacting your students and their families? Who would be best to discuss the accuracy of assessment and grading or other non-academic criteria that could be impacting your students? Every student needs deep and meaningful engagement. Every student should have at least one adult that they can go to discuss personal, private, or other sensitive topics. Is your school considering the needs of your special education populations, your gifted populations? And is there an examination if there is an over-identification of any group of students in either category? Are you looking at your resources like class size and collecting data on your school's conditions? And most importantly, does your school have good two-way communication and strong school-to-home connections? There are many considerations in providing an equitable education to all students, and that's why this work is so critical. So when we talk about creating equitable systems, the equitable leader must convey care and vulnerability in leading the work of creating an equitable work environment. Setting a clear and explicit vision for equity, ensuring that equity is owned at all levels, That means that everyone from the school crossing guard to the superintendent has to be engaged in equity work. Translating that equity into action. If you don't see what is happening as being equitable, then it probably isn't. And it says that you need to take a step back, look more closely, look more deeply, and lead with an equity lens. Building equity capacity for school leaders and staff, that means training. That means having those difficult conversations that might make us uncomfortable, but are in the best interest of our students. Ensuring equitable access to quality instruction. Do your teachers have access to professional development on the job, in the evenings, over the summer? And finally, do you have systems that encourage or enable your students and their families to thrive? And thriving is much, much better than surviving. Equity is a foundation, it's a mindset and an approach. And toward that end, here are many questions, and we will share them with you electronically, but I want you to think about what your answers are to these questions right now. What is your school or district's definition of equity? What are your measurable goals around equity and inclusion? How are your students thinking and feeling about equity and inclusion at your school or in your district? How might some groups of students be experiencing school climate differently than others? Who are those students who might be experiencing school climate differently than others? What academic achievement gaps might exist between groups of students? What groups of students may be over or underrepresented in advanced course enrollment or gifted and talented programs? What groups of students may be over or underrepresented in your disciplinary and behavioral data? What gaps might exist in the social emotional development of different groups of students? How might teacher perceptions of student social and emotional learning differ from what students are actually saying? Are students feeling heard? Are they able to lift their voice without retaliation? How might our attendance, or your school's attendance or district's attendance and chronic absenteeism rates differ by student groups? And what can you do to mitigate that? What are your hiring and retention rates for teachers of color? How ready and equipped do teachers and staff feel to address issues of diversity? How do families of different races, ethnicities, or cultures perceive your school or district climate? And when you get that data, how will you respond? Will you be defensive, or will you be open to the possibility that your school or district could be more equitable? What factors might be preventing parents from different races, ethnicities, or cultures from helping their children learn? And then, do we have systems that help us connect and act on inequities across all domains? Yes, equity forces us to ask lots of hard questions, but our students are worth it. Our families are worth it. Our communities are worth it. And together, we can create more equitable opportunities for our students and their families. I'm going to turn things over to Natalie, and she will extend our conversation by looking a little more closely at ways in which things might not be so equitable. Thank you for listening. Natalie?
Thank you, Vanetta. So as you just heard, there were many questions posed by Vanetta that illustrated some of the inequities that exist in schools and districts. Here, we explicitly identify the types of educational inequities that may exist in your school and or district, and those that asking pertinent questions would help you to identify and name and develop a plan for addressing. Today, we mainly focus on the highlighted areas only of programmatic inequity, staffing inequity, instructional inequity, and assessment inequity. Programmatic inequity is where school programming is set up in such a way that there is not access for certain students. As mentioned earlier, an example would be students of color being underrepresented in honors, AP, and IB courses. Looking on to staffing inequity, there are many items to consider. Certain districts are able to attract highly effective and highly qualified staff due to better compensation, better benefits, etc. Schools that lack such resources may have uncertified teachers, which leads to varying levels of instruction, which creates inequity. Representation matters. Having a lack of diversity in some schools and districts doesn't allow students of color to see role models, and therefore are often not exposed to content and material from differing points of view. i.e., students shouldn't make it to high school before experiencing a teacher that looks like them, or worse than that, never having a teacher or administrator that looks like them. Moving on to instructional inequity. Students may be enrolled in courses taught by less skilled teachers who may teach in a comparatively uninteresting or ineffective manner, or in courses which significantly less content is taught. Students may also be subject to conscious or unconscious favoritism, bias, or prejudice by some teachers, or the way in which instruction is delivered may not work as well for some students as it does for others. Lastly, assessment inequity. Students may be at a disadvantage when taking tests or completing other types of assessments due to the design, the content or language choices, or because they have learning disabilities or physical disabilities that may impair their performance. In addition, situational factors may adversely affect test performance. For example, lower income students who attend schools that do not regularly use computers may be disadvantaged compared to wealthier students who have more access to technology at home or who use computers regularly in school when taking tests that are administered on computers and that require basic computer literacy. Another example that goes along with the content of assessments is the rec room versus basement example. I recall when I was teaching and administering the state assessment, the writing prompt asking students to respond to activities conducted in a rec room. Many students raised their hands and said, Mrs. Turner, what's a rec room? Of course, I was unable to answer. Had we just considered vocabulary in our own unconscious or conscious biases, all students may have been able to successfully respond to that question. Every equity lens is different. Every district is unique, and therefore each journey will look different. And that is why it is important to understand that there is no cookie cutter way to do this work. What everyone can do, however, is to start by examining the 4 areas listed here on the slide. Examine your resource distribution, your education programs, your school climate, and your achievement. Dr. Sina Skelton from the Great Lakes Equity Center suggests asking these key questions. Who is not benefiting from the way things are? What are the system's barriers, the policies, practices, opportunities, and structures that prevent the identified group or groups from being able to access, be represented in, meaningfully participate in, and achieve positive outcomes from quality instruction and learning opportunities? What changes will we make to policies, practices, structures, and opportunities, and/or new understanding and knowledge to transform our system so that barriers to equity are disrupted and dismantled? And lastly, are we implementing strategies as planned? Have problematic policies, practices, and structures changed to support equitable outcomes? Are all students equitably benefiting from the effects of the implemented strategies and changes? Here is a practical way to process this information. Most districts and schools are asking the questions on the left side. For instance, what are the professional qualifications of teachers in the school? Instead of just asking this question, in order to add the equity lens, we should ask, do all students have equitable access to strong teachers? In addition, we collect information on the percentage of students who are chronically absent. However, to take it a step further, including equity is to look at how the rates of chronic absenteeism differ by student group. Ashara will now discuss how we build an equitable team. Ashara.
So now we're going to talk about your equitable team. Back in the spring, you laid the framework when you selected your continuous improvement team and you all developed those MICIP goals. Now it's time to implement those goals, and the mindset of your team is extremely important towards that success. So in this segment, we're going to talk a little bit about how to bring your team together to ensure that each member receives equitable support to develop the right mindset for this continuous improvement work. Continuous improvement calls for a common approach of empirically testing changes of a system by focusing on improving the interactions of people, processes, materials, and norms towards a common goal. So what stakeholder data will you collect, and how will you measure that success? You want to look at the frontline workers of the system. So that means your administrators, teachers, counselors, janitorial staff, cafeteria workers, all of those people who service students in the building. Their voice is extremely important because without them, the system will collapse. And who can best give voice to those gaps that you've identified? You also want to provide voice to those who use the system, which would be your students, parents, family, and community partners. They are the clients, and they have a right to voice how they're receiving services and interactions, and most importantly, express if it's working to meet their needs. So here we're going to do a little stop and jot. It's very important to make sure that you norm your continuous improvement team and have a clear understanding of the voices that are present in the room. So if you could grab a sheet of paper and just take a moment to stop and jot about how you would do this with your team. You may want to consider having the team actually go through these questions as an exercise together. So who am I? What is my standpoint in this equity work? What is the collective team why? How do we ensure that diversity is not just represented, but has meaningful participation? And remember that diversity is not inclusive or exclusive to race. What types of diversity are represented in your school and your district? Diversity includes culture, exceptional students, language, religion, gender, and students of the LGBTQ community. How do you not marginalize the diversity or voices that are small in number? Reflect on your own experiences as a team and think about how unconscious bias inevitably affects the work. How will you build processes and knowledge to help the team with this in the continuous improvement process? Think about what your greatest hope is for 100% of the students in your building, the students that you serve, and how will you make that a reality? Equity work is emotional and complex. It requires time, trust, and personal investment. This work cannot be done with a rote step-by-step process. The process can help to guide you, but the inquiry, reflections, and examination of personal biases are necessary to do this work. Changing the mindset and using a lens of equity is contextual and it's dynamic depending on the data that's in front of you at the time. And because this is a continuous improvement process, you're constantly looking at the data. So let's pause and reflect a little bit. Think about your team and how you're going to get them ready. What is your MICIP timeline for the year? Have you shared that timeline with all of your stakeholders? Will those meetings be monthly, bi-monthly, or quarterly? Do you have a common definition of equity? My colleagues talked about this a little bit earlier in the presentation. It's very important that everyone is on the same page. And do you have a specific vision of what equity should look like in your building or your district? And how will you support yourself and stakeholder growth in understanding equity and using an equity lens? This is not a one-time professional learning on equity and then you're ready to go. It's continuous. How will you prepare and provide a space for honest conversations about the equity work? When we see differently, we believe differently. When we believe differently, we behave differently. So as you're on this continuous improvement journey and you become more intentional about your mindset, your lens will become clearer in implementing that change with equity. So we've covered quite a bit of material in our time, but let's review some of the systems and processes that need to be examined with an equity mindset. Starting from the top, when we think about school improvement, what is your mission and vision? Does the message of equity resonate in the district and in the school mission and vision? Your hiring and retention, does the message of equity or does your hiring practices impact representation and positive outcomes for students? Are you retaining diverse populations? And if not, why not? Look at your decision making. Is everyone involved? Are all stakeholders represented, or are they at least given a chance to express their voice in the decision making? Resource allocation and support. Is it being done in the most impactful way to meet the needs of all students? Or are we just performing them in the ways we've traditionally done? Are you tapping your community partners and experts to help with that resource allocation? Tracking and class assignments. Who has access? Is it only from a deficit focus or mindset? Are students who need to be challenged being supported? Are you including after-school clubs, AP, IB courses? And then looking at that data, what is the trend for access and the passing of these opportunities for all students? And that goes into our data and research. Who will keep the team abreast of the current data and research on practices, as well as support the team with viewing the local data with a lens of equity? Who will be your data expert on the team and support the rest of the team in understanding the data? Feedback and evaluation. This is so important in continuous improvement. How is your effective and productive feedback being provided to teachers and support staff on those MICIP goals? And how are you evaluating the equitable changes? Are you looking at how you're measuring it? Professional learning. Are you supporting yourself, the team, and the staff on equity? As we, again, we said this is something that's ongoing and dynamic because things in the building change, conditions change. So how are we adjusting as we move along with those goals? And equity teams. Who are going to be your formal and informal leaders in the building around this work? And always remember that don't limit this work to just staff members who are part of underrepresented groups as they lead this equity work. Equity work belongs to everyone on the team. So how are you fostering equity, diversity, and justice within your building? Looking at these categories will help you. And so now has come the time for your questions. So we're going to end here, and we look forward to seeing what questions you have about mindset and working with your team.